Welcome, everybody. I am so excited for today's webinar, mostly because for at least the last year, if not two, we've been talking about how to fund the activities that you're doing as house liaisons. And one of the words I keep saying in these meetings is Perkins. And this is finally our opportunity to get to talk about what Perkins is and what kinds of things Perkins can fund and how Perkins connects, especially to career and tech ed students who are experiencing homelessness or students coming out of foster care. And to help me with today's session, we're super lucky to have Janelle Washington with us. Janelle is the Senior Director for CTE programming at Illinois Community College Board, and she is really the state's go-to person about how Perkins operates and the ways in which we can use these kinds of funds. Oh, sorry, I got all faked out by the meeting chat. Okay, so for today's agenda, these are going to be the buckets that we're going to explore. So first, we're going to do just a rough overview of what the Perkins grant is all about. And then we're going to talk about this requirement as part of the law that funds Perkins. And it's about this comprehensive local needs assessment. And we think that can be a place where you can bring your data and your ideas about the kinds of things you're doing for house liaisoning, especially for career and technical education students. That's going to be kind of the piece you're going to need to always keep on your radar when we're talking about Perkins, is the students in question need to be related to career and technical education. And there's this local needs assessment that the institutions are doing every few years. So we think there's a way for you to kind of plug into that in order to help you build a case for why Perkins funds could maybe be something for you to use when you're thinking about the house liaison services. And then again, kind of underscoring the ways you can use Perkins and how we see that connected to house. And then, of course, as always, a few resources to help you in the work. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Janelle to talk to us a bit about what Perkins is all about.
Well, thank you so much, Patty. As Patty said, I'm just going to take a moment to kind of level set, talk about Perkins, give you an overview of the legislation, and then our application here in Illinois. So Perkins has a lot of names. The Carl D. Perkins Career and Technical Education Act. The current iteration is actually called the Strengthening Career and Technical Education for the 21st Century Act, and it was signed into law July 31st, 2018, and took effect July 1, 2019. And so we call this iteration Perkins 5, and we also call it Perkins for short. I think the main thing to note, though, about Perkins is that it is the legislation that provides guidance for CTE in the U.S., and then it also provides funding to help to support CTE programming at the secondary and post-secondary levels. In Illinois, the Illinois State Board of Education, or ISB, receives our state's Perkins allocation. So we get this Perkins allocation from the federal government, and then we split that allocation with 60% staying with ISB to support CTE on the post-secondary level. On the secondary level. And then ICCB gets 40% of our state's allocation to support CTE on the post-secondary level. And then from there, when ICCB receives our funding, we run a formula and determine how much of that allocation goes to each individual community college to support CTE locally at their institutions. I also want to note here that ISB and ICCB work really, really closely together to implement CTE in the state as a whole via our Perkins State Plan that we're required to submit to the Federal Office of Career, Technical, and Adult Education every 4 years. And so we work together to develop a state plan for how we're going to implement CTE in the state. It includes some joint activities across secondary and post-secondary, and then also, any specific secondary activities on the state level, and then post-secondary. So we work really, really closely together. So Perkins does include a focus on academic rigor, on in-demand sector alignment, which we're going to discuss a little later. I also want to point out the sub baccalaureate focus. And so 4-year colleges don't receive Perkins grants as the focus is on those industry recognized credentials, post-secondary certificates, and associate's degrees. And so finally, Perkins encourages career exploration as early as the 5th grade and continuing all the way through community college. And we're going to kind of talk a little bit more about that, I think, in the next slide, too. There's also a focus on work-based learning. So students get that hands-on experience necessary for working in their field of study, after they complete their credentials. And then there's a really big focus on secondary to post-secondary transitions and alignment. And that's a really huge focus of programs of study that are defined within Perkins. And that's where learners can pursue a coordinated and non-duplicative sequence of courses that they start in secondary and can continue all the way through post-secondary, ultimately earning a post-secondary credential, and maybe even multiple if they're, because programs of study can include stackable credentials. And so maybe you earn a few welding certificates along the way to earning your degree, associate's degree in welding. And I think one thing that I really wanted to point out, because I know a lot of house liaisons work in financial aid, the key to remember is that the Perkins that we're talking about here is a federal grant that's provided to community colleges to support CTE programming as a whole, and not like the Perkins loan that's provided to students like on an individual level. And so here with the Perkins grant, there are very limited, and we're going to talk about those, but limited circumstances that students can receive direct student support, but very, very limited. So just want to make sure that we're not confusing it with the federal Perkins loan. Next slide. Okay, so within the Perkins grant, each year Perkins grantees have to submit a local application where they detail the activities that they're going to conduct during the fiscal year. And some of those activities include career exploration and career development, kind of like we talked earlier. That could start as early in the 5th grade. And so we'll see a lot of our community colleges working with secondary partners to bring middle school or high school students onto campus, providing some career exploration in that way. Also professional development for teachers, faculty, school leaders, administrators, specialized instructional support personnel, career guidance and academic counselors, or paraprofessionals. So there could definitely be a way that you could be aligning with your Perkins folks to see if any PD could be supported for house liaisons through Perkins. Within the Perkins program annually, the grantees have to talk about how they're going to equip learners with the skills that they need to pursue careers in CTE fields. They also have to talk about how they're going to integrate academic skills into CTE programs. So think like contextualized coursework, like what's the specific math that a welding student might need on a job, or like, is there like a specific technical writing that a nurse might need to write a report, or maybe even anyone in any field might need to write up a report in that specific area. And so like kind of contextualizing that and integrating those academic skills into that more like hands-on CTE focus. And there's always the focus on improving student achievement and meeting state performance goals. And then finally, the grantees are required to conduct evaluations like the Comprehensive Local Needs Assessment, or CLNA, that we're going to be kind of more diving into here in a couple slides. Okay, so well, as far as Perkins special populations, so Perkins identifies 9 special populations for which grant recipients may provide this limited direct student support to enable those students to persist in CTE. to complete CTE programs of study, or career pathways. And so Perkins also requires every year that specific activities be conducted with the focus on ensuring that students who are members of special populations can access and succeed in CTE, and that they're prepared to enter the workforce when they complete their credential. And also there's requirements that they include in the Perkins plan every year, activities that ensure that students are not discriminated against based on their status as members of special populations. And so the special populations are listed here below. Some that I want to like kind of call out are number 5, the individuals preparing for non-traditional fields. And you notice that says gender only. And so when we're talking about non-traditional, we also use the language like non-traditional students, non-traditional fields. So this just means students who are studying in fields where their gender comprises like less than 25% of the individuals working in that field. And so you can think like women in welding, maybe men in nursing, fields like that. So that's what we mean when we talk about non-traditional, not non-traditional for age, non-traditional for gender, according to the field. And then obviously number 8, individuals experiencing homelessness, and that is why we're here today. With that, alignment where house liaisons, where we overlap. And we'll talk about here shortly some of that direct student support that Perkins will provide to support, or can provide to support those special population students.
Thanks, Janelle. Sorry, I jumped ahead on the slides. So you can see how much Janelle knows about how this kind of funding works, right? One of the things that I wanted to point out is when we think about that list of special populations, students experiencing homelessness, to Janelle's point, is one of the items on that list. So are foster care involved youth. And the thing I think is really great about this language is you should recognize this from the kind of language that is in the House Liaison statute also, right? That who Perkins considers to be a student experiencing homelessness is the same as McKinney-Vento, frankly, and with a few other pieces in here, like also considering children who are migratory. So I thought that was also just kind of a good call out, that you can see this resonance between the pieces of legislation. And then similarly, for youth who are considered students in care, again, similar kind of language to what we see in the House Liaison statute, right? So either in or have aged out of the foster care system, or they're in an alternative living environment due to a situation with their legal guardian, or they've reached their 21st birthday and have aged out of the system, but they're still covered as under House Liaison work, and then also under Perkins 5 eligibility as a special population. Back to you, Janelle.
All right. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about, we'll talk about the Perkins like kind of grant cycle, if you will, and then specifically about the comprehensive local needs assessment. And so Perkins kind of works in a cycle. Every 4 years, we'll start with the comprehensive local needs assessment, and we'll dive into that a little and more in the next slide. But so that is a process that the colleges all have to conduct for their Perkins application or for their Perkins grant, and that process informs a 4-year Perkins plan. So every 4 years, Perkins recipients are required to develop a 4-year local application where they think more strategically about Perkins, and they develop long-term goals that they want to meet over the 4 years, and then annual objectives that they're going to work towards each year to help them meet their long-term goal. And then from there, they also have to develop annual work plans each year, annual work plan, annual work plans every year of the 4-year plan, right? And so that's where they talk about every year those specific activities that they're going to be conducting that's going to help them meet those objectives. the objectives that like Perkins lays out, and also their own annual objectives and long-term goals. And so the four-year plan and the CLNA, they both inform the annual work plan each year. And you might know like there's a little discrepancy. So like they complete the CLNA every 2 years. So at the top of that four-year cycle, they're completing a 2 year of CLNA. And then in 2 more years, they'll complete another one. And that's, that one is going to help to inform the upcoming like final 2 years of the application cycle. So always continuous improvement, and we'll talk about that later. But I think the key here, and kind of Patty mentioned this a little earlier, is like where you can get in on all of this. And so Patty mentioned the CLNA process. I'll come back to that. But one is the actual Perkins application, that, and because they're doing this every year, where they're planning out the activities that they're going to be conducting for the upcoming fiscal year. And so that's a good time for house liaisons to be in contact to see if there's room for alignment in supporting students experiencing homelessness or students in care. Those I want to note for you all that the Perkins applications are usually open in March. And so, anytime before March, like just continuous like conversation. So they're open in March. They're usually due in May. It's upcoming, they're due this Friday. So like now wouldn't be a good time to be like, can I get in on, on Perkins? But obviously like throughout the year, things change, and like there may be room for budget mods or, things like that, modifications if there's some really great idea. Like it could be that you could talk to your Perkins admin, and they might be able to make some modifications. However, just keep in mind that the applications are typically due in May, and that's where they're going to be planning for that upcoming year, right? And so always be in contact. And then also the CLNA process is, as Patty discussed, that's definitely a place where house liaison should be involved as a stakeholder to ensure that students experiencing homelessness, students in care are represented in the data, and then the CLNA as a whole, because like I said, that CLNA is going to inform the activities that are going to be conducted during the fiscal year to support CTE students. And so just thinking about the timeline for that process, the Perkins administrators will have a CLNA due in February of 2026, and they're going to be starting that process in July of this year. And so yeah, hopefully that's a place where you'd be able to align and support that process to make sure that those students are represented and included. So a little bit more about the CLNA, again, the Comprehensive Local Needs Assessment. So it's a continuous improvement process, and it allows community colleges to assess the extent to which their CTE programs and programs of study are aligned with the local workforce and economic needs in the area. And then there's like these elements that we have to focus on through the CLNA. So, how are students performing in CTE programs of study? And that data, that student data is disaggregated by special populations and other student demographics. And so, again, we want to make sure, I think, sometimes I've experienced that a lot of Perkins administrators, a lot of CTE folks say it's sometimes difficult to identify students who are experiencing homelessness or students who are in care. I think obviously those are usually self-reported, and sometimes it's difficult to connect. So definitely aligning to make sure that we're understanding the students and identifying them so they can so we can to serve them in the ways that we can through Perkins. And so so the CLNA helps with that. Also understanding any gaps in performance for those students. Also, whether CTE programs are sufficient in size, scope, and quality to meet the needs of all learners served by the college. Whether CTE programs of study are aligned to the local in-demand industry sectors or occupations. So making sure that they're focusing on programs of study that students are going to be able to actually, leave the college and go get a job in that local area. And that you're meeting the need of your local employers. One of the other elements is this evaluation evaluating the progress towards implementing CTE programs of study, and then describing how recruitment, retention, and training of faculty and staff will be improved. And then finally, the CLNA requires a description of the progress towards the implementation of equal access to high quality career and technical education courses and programs of study for students. So that's the CLNA in like a nutshell. So it's like this huge process that involves many stakeholders. Like it shouldn't ever be conducted by the Perkins administrator alone, because we really want to have a comprehensive look at programs of study and students and making sure that they can access. And so I know Patty's going to be talking about the stakeholders who are involved in the process. And so.
Yes, thank you. So this is a list of who all is recommended to be included in that comprehensive local needs assessment process. And you can see the especially the bottom three bullets to me are where the House liaisons can really plug in. So actual representatives of the special population, so the students that you work with can potentially be folks that are involved in the process. I realize it's often difficult to get direct student input by having students serve on committees, especially when they're juggling all kinds of other things. But again, having you as the next bullet, you being their representative, or you also working with your continuum of care or other partners that you've been working with to support students in care or students experiencing homelessness, and any of the other kinds of stakeholders, if you're working with landlords or other folks that can just sort of shed a light on what the needs are for the group that you're working with, I think will help. The first couple of bullets around CTE programs and workforce folks, usually the CTE deans and chairs and faculty have pretty good grips on those pieces and parts. I feel like the gifts that you guys really bring are this guidance around what would benefit students experiencing homelessness or students in care, right? So I think that's, again, a place where you can join this conversation and bring the data that you have about the students you've been working with and be thinking about what are those larger needs and again how they plug into CTE programs. So if you're able to use your data to demonstrate a pattern that shows that 90% of the students that you're working with are in a CTE program, that's a great piece of data to bring to the CLNA process, and then to kind of put that piece of information into this data engine that ultimately helps to drive what the vision is for how the Perkins funds are spent at your organization. So that's just something I kind of wanted to highlight here, is that you can have a seat at the table for the CLNA if you're so inclined. And then these are just some of the typical moving parts inside the Perkins local plan and work plan. So as Janelle was talking about, the CTE folks at your schools are putting together these plans. ISB and ICCB put some curbs around that for us. So for ICCB, these are the pieces where we're looking at, how do the Perkins funded projects at your institution help students of special populations learn about career and technical course offerings, occupations that pay good wages? How are you looking at issues of access and disparities and gaps of performance? So I feel like these again are kind of, and you can see I put not an exhaustive list. So there are other places in the work plan or the local plan that probably also make sense. But these are just some places where you at least see a call out about special populations fitting into Perkins. And then Janelle, I'm going to have you talk a little bit about student supports in Perkins and what's allowable or not so much.
Okay. So I think this is a great piece to talk about, especially as you're working to serve students. Um, who may, align with the CTE special populations. And so, like I mentioned before, direct student support is really limited in the Perkins Grant because the primary goal is to really benefit CTE as a whole. But Perkins has consistently made provisions to provide limited direct student support for students who are members of special populations, understanding that these students may need additional support to reduce or eliminate out-of-pocket expenses that may be creating a barrier for them accessing or fully participating in CTE. And so some of those include the direct student support includes like transportation assistance, childcare assistance, textbook or supply loans. So like, maybe a toolkit or a laptop, things like that. And so a lot of the colleges will have like a lending library where students can borrow, like I said, laptops, calculators, any supplies or materials that they might need. But again, the key with that is that those have to be borrowed and returned so other students can have access to them. However, like with the transportation, that could be in the form of a gas card or like bus tokens, things like that. So very, very limited in the support that Perkins has allowed throughout the year to support students. And we'll talk about some things that are not allowable. But the following, these conditions have to be met. The student must be a member of a special population and be participating in CTE. And then the assistance is going to be able to provide or address an overwhelming barrier that is, impeding that student's success or participation. And then also we want to make sure that the assistance is part of a larger set of strategies to address the needs of special populations. We'll see it, year after year that this is included, but like, is there another way that we can make sure that we're more like holistically supporting students? And then finally, funds must supplement and not supplant assistance. And we'll talk about that here shortly. So some things that are not allowable, again, as I said, because we're like making sure that we're not focused on, we want to make sure that we focus on CTE as a whole. However, still providing that limited support, to overcome barriers. And so tuition and fees are not allowable. And these type of student incentives, awards, or membership fees are not allowable. So like one is I think membership fees are just in general, individual membership fees are not allowable. Then also stipends for student participation in CTE program or activities, that's never allowable with Perkins funds. However, we do have some competitive grants that may allow for those type of stipends, but the federal Perkins grant does not allow for student stipends for participation. And then food and beverages, they're not allowable either. So I know that's like a huge barrier, could be for students, but that's not allowable. And so we often find collaboration with, Perkins folks, collaborating with other people on the campus to provide, assistance with food and in other ways, but not through Perkins.
Yep. And I feel like that also fits in with the here, I'll go back a slide. With this idea about this almost to the bottom bullet, assistance must be part of a larger set of strategies to address the needs of the special population. You know what I mean? So for you all to be thinking about ways to kind of braid funding together. So if Perkins can cover certain kinds of things, then hopefully other folks can cover the pieces that are not allowed to be done on Perkins's dime.
Absolutely. That's where, yeah, that
Right?
collaboration is definitely key.
Agreed. Okay, so you all have been an excellent audience so far for the first half hour, but Janelle and I want to have you do something a little bit active. So we're going to give you a couple of checkpoints as we go along through our session today. So this is the first one. This is a CTE student, and what we want you to do is take a minute to read this over, and then either in the chat or come off mute, think about, as a house liaison, what services might you offer and which of them could potentially be fundable by Perkins. So you'll notice that this is the story of Carlos. Carlos is enrolled as a welding certificate student. So Carlos is a CTE student. And then you can kind of read the rest about his situation. So take a minute and kind of read about it. And then in the chat or coming off mute, tell us, as a house liaison, what services might you offer to Carlos? And then what might be Perkins eligible?
I have a thought.
Yes, Teresa.
So I'm thinking about specifically the challenges around not being able to store tools. Can a Perkins grant pay for a set of lockers or something that all students can use around addressing that issue? I'm not sure.
Unfortunately, that would be considered, that wouldn't be allowable because it's kind of considered like, I mean, it's not like but kind of considered furniture and like in general use. So unfortunately, that wouldn't be allowable. But potentially, if they're borrowing the tools, like they have a toolkit that they're borrowing through Perkins and they're leaving that at the school, like I'm pretty sure that could be.
Okay. Okay.
But that good thoughts, like yes. But and
Yeah.
also I want to note too, I think we did have a college who like a Perkins administrator who working with students experiencing homelessness, like they worked with some other folks on campus to kind of leverage like lockers. And Patty, I think that was Anna at Rock Valley kind of talked um about that, where they,
Yeah. And I think that's the way to think about it, Teresa, is like Perkins could buy the tools through like a lending library program, but then your foundation could maybe buy the lockers for this student and other students to store their tools, or depending on how you do the lending library, it could be something where students just check the tools out during their class period and then check them back in, and they're stored like as program equipment. You know what I mean? So like there, I think you're onto something, and I agree with Janelle that like half the battle here is thinking through which pieces and parts are clear Perkins and which are either murky or just outright no-nos. But I agree with Janelle. Like I think you're thinking the right way about this idea. It's just a matter of what can go where.
I think I saw a similar question, like something about showers, but unfortunately, PERT is limited to that, like gap, transportation, childcare, things like that. So showers, unfortunately, at this time have not been identified within the legislation as allowable expense for students, special populations.
Well, and Sarah, there might be a potentially easier way to handle that if there's somewhere on campus that students are able to already access, like if you have a gym or like a workout room, sometimes there are shower facilities kind of built in locker room areas, maybe. So I don't know if that's possible. And then
Yeah, that is something I'd asked about. We have, it's very limited where we're at. And so I'm not really sure that that's going to be an option, but I'm going to check back on that or see if we can purchase maybe some shower vouchers through like our student emergency funds.
well, and also keep in mind what Janelle was saying too about other other kinds of grants that flow through ICCB may have less restrictions than Perkins, right? Because part of the game we're playing with Perkins is it's a federal stream of revenue, so it has a tighter curbs, let's say, than some of these other kinds of streams. So it could be that it comes maybe from your foundation, or it could also be that you keep an eye out for some of these other grant opportunities from ICCB where there's a little more wiggle room, and then maybe that becomes something, again, you can kind of braid into that other source. So you could maybe do the gas cards out of Perkins, and you can do shower vouchers out of a different pot of money.
Thank you.
Yeah. And Patricia, I see you're on Sarah's wavelength about shelters and gas cards. And I like where you're going too about talking to the welding instructors about, can students leave things in the classroom and how can they be secure and that kind of stuff. And it sounds like you've also got a good agency that you're working with that can also kind of help with some of those pieces and parts, right? So the one thing I do enjoy about this particular case study, though, is I do feel like what's sort of built in is that the standard in Perkins, where you have to demonstrate that this support you're giving to a student is part of a larger set of strategies, right? So like when it's under support system, if we know that this student is already connected with their navigator to apply for benefits and they're already using their local food pantry, like you've already kind of started to meet that other standard in Perkins about whatever you do for Carlos, it's going to be one piece of what's already appearing as kind of this larger set of strategies. Okay, so Janelle, can you talk to us a little bit about supplanting?
Yes, I'll do my best. Okay, so I think one of the keys to leveraging Perkins funds to support like house initiatives or just students experiencing homelessness, students in care, is just to making sure that there's alignment and that the Perkins funds are supplementing and not supplanting non-Perkins funds. And so supplanting is presumed to occur in three circumstances. And so that means like where the college is using Perkins funds to provide services that they were either required to make available under other federal, state, local laws. And I know that kind of gets a little tricky when you have, unfunded mandates such as, this initiative. So you're required by law to provide some services, but there's no funding attached to it. So I know that kind of gets a little tricky. Also, if services were provided with non-federal funds in the year prior, so we were funding some activity last year with some institutional funds, and now we want to switch it over to Perkins, that could be supplanting. Unless there's a way that, the college can demonstrate that position would actually go away and students would, that would be a detriment to students as a result. I mean, in the third circumstances where services were provided with non-federal funds for non-CTE students, but charged to Perkins for CTE students. And so I think a couple things that came to mind for me to be careful about when it comes to like house initiatives and Perkins and aligning those is that one thing that came to mind was like using Perkins funds to pay a portion of the house liaison salary, right? And so Perkins can be used to fund positions according to the percentage of time that position is working with CTE. Or Perkins. However, you have to be mindful, for example, that the portion of time that house liaisons work with students experiencing homelessness or students in care is not charged to Perkins, while other funds are used to support, the rest of the salary. So that could be a tricky situation. So if you're, providing services to students, in general, you can't say, okay, but for these populations, we're going to charge it to Perkins. Like you wouldn't be able to do that. Or maybe like you found funding to support tutoring for students that you're serving. But then you want to require that Perkins pay to support the tutoring for the CTE students experiencing homelessness or students in care. That would be supplanting. So that wouldn't be allowable. But I think one thing to note is that, and Patty kind of talked to it about, rating and funding, or like, accessing specific resources, where because that limited direct student support, like the gas cards and, transportation assistance as a whole, or childcare, or the tool, because that's allowable in Perkins. Like if you chose like, hey, we're gonna send our students, our CTE students experiencing homelessness to Perkins because they have funding for them, that's totally allowable because it's allowed within the Perkins legislation. And so that's just been, to me, a little strategic, right? And then also making sure that you're collaborating and communicating to avoid like students potentially receiving duplicative support, right? So, if they're getting transportation assistance over here and then going to Perkins for it too, like let's make sure that that's not happening. But if you want to like say, yeah, this is a resource that's available to you, make sure that you're connecting with the CTE folks over there to like, they usually have an application that students can fill out to self-identify their special population status. And then from there, they'll offer them the support. And so they can definitely go do that. And that would not be considered supplanting.
And one of the things, Janelle, I totally forgot to ask you to speak about this topic, but the way that the colleges get support from ICCB and from your team for Perkins is that each institution has a liaison who's specifically their Perkins go-to person for ICCB. So if you all are working with your Perkins grant administrator at your college and you have an idea and you think, hey, I think this could maybe be something we could fund via Perkins, that human being at your school knows who on Janelle's team is the person they should reach out to have that chat and to pitch that idea before they write it into the grant. So you don't have to wait until you write it into the grant and then it gets kicked back for reasons. You can have your Perkins administrator reach out to ICCB and float the idea in advance, and then they can kind of help you think through the ways in which this does align or doesn't align with what Perkins is asking of your institution.
That's a great point.
Yeah, sorry, should have thought about that sooner. The joys of working with me, Janelle. So the other thing that we wanted to highlight was there's no set dollar amount for Perkins grants. When you look across the state of Illinois, because Illinois uses a formula to calculate how much each institution gets, your institution may get $200,000 for Perkins. It may get close to $1 million for Perkins. So the size of the grant varies depending on different factors at your institution. So if you find that your institution is kind of one of the smaller grants, these might be some of the kinds of things you could do as Perkins projects that would also benefit the students who are under the House Liaison umbrella. So we've already talked about the gas cards, and I'll show you some language about that. But the other things that we talk about frequently, like looking at your website language and kind of tuning it up to be more kind of plain language friendly, and creating other kinds of plain language documents, coming up with student resource guides and those kinds of things. We've talked about nudging before, right? And kind of like how you can send emails or electronic alerts, but like having some Perkins funds to pay for the development of some of those tools, I think is a reasonable way to talk about how to better reach special populations, including students who are homeless or students who are in care. And then again, this kind of thinking about collaboration and getting time to get together to think about how students are kind of navigated between the various and sundry areas. Usually we talk about how we move students between, say, counseling and financial aid, but now we're introducing career and tech ed as like kind of the third leg of the stool. So it's blessing and a curse, right? Like it's an opportunity for funding, but now it just complicated potentially that kind of workflow between you all and with the students. So thinking about that, thinking about working with data stewards, to Janelle's earlier point about how we go about identifying students experiencing homelessness, and this self-identification process can often be a bit of a challenge. And again, just even having as part of that working group, looking at policies and kind of reviewing and revising things that you think could be potentially creating barriers. All of those are kind of things you can do if you have kind of a smaller grant. If you have a larger grant, then I would say everything on the small grant slide plus extra odds and ends, right? So you could hire humans to help do some of this support work. Again, noting Janelle's cautionary tale around supplanting. But again, other kinds of things, like we've talked a bit about how training staff and faculty is a component that House liaisons are responsible for. You could maybe put something together that's a little more robust, or that includes a resource guide, right? And as we've talked about before, kind of absorbing these other costs of attendance by doing textbook or supply lending libraries. And again, the trick with the lending library idea is that it gives students access to the tools and supplies that they need, the textbooks that they need, without actually giving it to the student as like an actual, as direct support to the student. And then I know many of you out there are already huge fans of the good people at Schoolhouse Connections, and they have this great document about gas cards and the language around how they, kind of their policies and procedures about how they distribute them, how they kind of manage that. So I thought that was kind of worth showing you. So again, you can kind of see how they kind of skin the cat here. And then this link to this Google document at the bottom will take you to a fuller version of the text and forms and that kind of stuff. So if you're thinking about gas cards, definitely check that out. And then again, this idea of nudging, using email or bulk text or learning management systems, for the most part, again, to avoid the supplanting issue, what we'd really be talking about doing is more kind of the design work around creating the emails or the banners or that kind of stuff. So not a huge expense, but something that you could potentially kind of use. And again, playing this idea of zone instead of one-to-one. Okay, so here is our second case checkpoint. So this is for a student named Jasmine, and Jasmine's CTE program is cosmetology. So again, like, look at the case, think about the supports you might offer, and then pitch an idea that you think could be Perkins eligible. And same as before, you can come off mute or you can put ideas into the chat. Are you stumped by Jasmine? I feel like in many ways this is similar, right, to the, yes, Hannah, I agree, right? Jasmine seems like a good candidate for transportation support. Yes, right? So, and again, this idea where Jasmine's borrowing a friend's car, but it's not wildly reliable access to transportation. So maybe some fare cards. Yep. And Sarah, right, also for kit supplies, right? That could be, again, this idea of a lending library and those kinds of tools could really be something that could support Jasmine's work. And then the other thing that I just wanted to kind of put on your radar, let's say, when it comes to Perkins, is the folks who are doing the Perkins grant do want to be thinking about how all of these supports impact the outcomes for students. So some of you heard the webinar we did last week about thinking about inputs, outputs, and outcomes. So for Perkins, really thinking about obtaining that post-secondary certificate, degree, or industry recognized credential is really where the rubber meets the road. So ideally, by providing support to your house students, that'll help increase the numbers of students experiencing homelessness who are able to complete coursework any given semester, or who are able to complete that post-secondary credential. You can also, as one of the objectives, talk about how many students are going to be engaging with you as the liaison. So also just be thinking about this idea about how do we measure what we're doing beyond just counting numbers of things, but just thinking about like, are we able to help students get to the end of that CTE course? Are we able to help students get to the end of their certificate or degree program? Because that's really what we want to see for all of the CTE students. Okay, and then one final checkpoint before we get to resources. So again, look at Ron's case. Ron is a medical assisting student. And then this is Ron's scenario. So what kinds of supports would you offer him? And what do you think could potentially be a Perkins eligible scenario? Thanks, Hannah. Yep, possible childcare assistance, right? Oh, that's an interesting thought. Janelle, do you see that in the chat that Hannah is asking about if we could use Perkins funds to keep student spaces open longer or extra hours?
That's
Planting.
right. That's not something that's not something I've ever seen, or like how that could be funded. Um, I mean, it could be, maybe there could be labs, on campus that are, open within CTE and funded. So it could be, something like that. That's interesting. But I could see that, I could see if there's like a lab space that, and CTE is funding like a lab assistant, or, um to kind of to work that space and keep it open for students. I could see that being part of it. Again, I'm gonna promote the whole collaborating with your Perkins folks to talk about what could be possible, what they might already be doing. And I think one thing I wanted to point out about Ron's situation is this intersecting identities, right? Where Ron is he meets several special populations, right? He's a single parent. He's a student experiencing homelessness. He could very well be a non-traditional student for his gender, depending on, medical assisting. So like leveraging those different, ways to support students is really key in this situation, and understanding that he obviously dealing with a lot of intersecting issues and barriers.
Yep, and Teresa, same kind of idea, right? Like thinking about the childcare piece and how can you shape that in a way that will support Ron. Yeah. And others like him, right?
Yeah, our child care center closes at 5:30. So if there's any kind of CTE program, like a lot of our welding and a lot of our heating and air conditioning and their evening only classes. And so if we can provide childcare support via, paying for extra personnel.
Yeah. And I think back to Janelle's point about intersectionality, right? So many of you probably wearing multiple hats at your institution are probably responsible for some of these other special populations as well. So thinking about how can you use data to help drive these ideas, like how can you figure out this intersectionality? How can you figure out like which students who are single parents are also enrolled in CTE and are taking evening courses, build your argument using the data. Because if Ron is just the only one of his kind, it probably becomes more difficult to provide some of these things on campus. But if Ron is one of 7 in the evenings who has this issue, I think now you're starting to get to a point of critical mass where the institution would probably be like, yeah, okay, like we're approaching critical mass on this issue.
I can't believe we're over time.
I know, I'm so sorry.
It went by so fast.
Just quickly, everybody, there's some great resources out there that ICSPS and ICCB have put together about students in care and students experiencing homelessness. They will give you a lot of extra ideas if you need them. And then I also just thought it might be helpful. There's a really great grant manual out there about Perkins that answers a lot of questions and pretty much was the source material for the slideshow for today. So there's a link here to that. And then again, to the special populations pages and definitions via the Perkins folks, and then also Brittany's crew at ICSPS and their super strategies. So I want to thank Janelle Washington for participating and being our guest speaker today. As always, I always learn stuff when I listen to you. So thank you so much for doing this for us. And if you have questions for Janelle, her contact information is on this slide. If you have questions for me, my contact information is also on this slide. But yes, we're definitely beyond time. So thank you all for being on the call today.